when working in the Global South, and we will begin with you, Iccha.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the prompt, and I'm glad to be here. And it was a very exciting session to start with, and hopefully I could sort of piggyback into some of that conversation. But I wanted to start with this idea of what do we really mean by intersections, right? Particularly locating ourselves where we are and talking about the Global South. And so I was thinking, well, we could talk about intersections in the context of north to south, right? Where often, as the first panel was talking about, the South is seen as subjects of observation, right? To be viewed and studied. So we become the outcome, right? In terms of, as well as the process. And also tools of Western methods are used, right, in terms of extractive logic, as some of the conversations that were taking place earlier. And then I thought, okay, so intersections, there's one way of thinking about intersections. There's another way of thinking about intersection, which is also something that came up, which is this sort of south to south, right, connections, where we become the point of theorization, the point of, right, decolonizing method, the point of flipping the lens and re-inverting this notion of, right, what is method and what does it look like if we think of the South first, as opposed to the object of being studied. And then there's a third, I think the third intersection as well, which is kind of thinking about the specific spaces within the South, right? There's a contextual understanding, and some of this came up earlier too when we were talking about colonization, history of caste, history of really discrimination, right? Are those brought in by colonization? Were there already some of those inherent in our cultures before that, and it just became exacerbated because they became the tool to which power could be used, right? So then, you know, and there are similarities in that way, but there's also differences. Even if we think about colonial histories, even if we think about, right, dynasties and, you know, monarchies and things like that. So I was just, so, you know, I had been thinking about that. And so when this came up earlier, it made me think a little even more about, really, I think even your question about how do intersections constitute methods when working in the Global South, right? I think we need to start with unpacking that question itself and thinking about what intersections are we talking about? And are they going to be similar when we talk about methods, looking at those intersections? And the answer is, right, clearly not, because what we are talking about is moving beyond this north to south intersection, where the South becomes a subject to more south to south solidarity, south to south theorization, and point of theorization, and really building your method in that way, right? So what does that mean? There's a practical question as well as a theoretical question of what do we mean when we say building the method from the South, right? Well, what would that look like if you think about intersections? And that connects to the third point I was talking about, which is the complications and the nuances that we have to think about, that those are going to be country specific, culture specific. Even within certain cultures, there's going to be differences. So even if you talk about South to South, kind of a point of theorization and methodological understanding and flipping this, you know, extractive logic, I think I would also say we need to be careful about not making that a universal conversation where we then forget that each of those spaces are also individual and contextual. And when we take that idea, as they talk about India right now and talk about Nepal and what's happening with COVID, right, and vaccines, there is a, you know, political, historical, cultural connections, but there's also power differences that are being used, right? In addition to the conversation that was happening about how India was exporting vaccines and then came in and now, you know, and there's questions of really centering India in that process as opposed to that. But when you think about India in connection to Nepal, I would ask the same question, right? In terms of this power, in terms of how those logics are being flipped when you are talking about your neighbors and you are the center of power, right? So when we talk about South to South, I think we have to think about methods in the context specific and the relationship that are in that. So practically speaking, I would say in a simpler way of answering this question of intersections constituting method, really, I think what comes from that, or what I'm implying perhaps, is that we need to locate, right, more contextual intersections. We need to think about the lived experiences and the voices. So the same story, right, from somebody thinking about vaccines and thinking about what's happening in India and the larger logic of neoliberal logic of market, you know, I have a different story to say in the same place as somebody from Nepal, then somebody from India, then somebody from Bangladesh, right? Because of the differences even in that region and the identity that is assumed because we come from that similar space and supposedly similar cultural, you know, similarities, languages, whatever it may be. So in that sense, I think voices, right, are very important when we think about this methodological intersections and the stories and the lived experiences, in really thinking about how we can bring together, on one hand, re-inverting the lens so that we are not always a subject, right, the point of extractive logic, but at the same time, thinking of ways in which those methods are located in a way that is inclusive, right? And also, and it's a challenge, right? How do you make it an inclusive conversation that brings in everybody's history, logic, identity, conversations, at the same time also leave those markers and spaces where it could be very specific to wherever you know, that conversation is happening. And then the last thing I would say, I think what is also important is kind of thinking about embodiment, right? And something that was said about earlier, that I think the difference in terms of a methodological differences, if we are thinking about the way it's always been and understood in how sterile it is to what we are thinking about in the context of the South, is that our bodies, right, our ways in which we assume our responsibilities, the ways in which we interact with our communities, has a very embodied conversation to it. And I think that is part of the method that, you know, separates really thinking about locating it in the South, global South, versus kind of using this, you know, method. And I mean, we teach method classes, I've taught method classes, and it's a very sterile way of thinking about teaching a method, right? It is a very systematic way of doing, and we forget the messiness of it, that we forget how we are also implicated in that, and how we also, you know, implicate other people into that process. Like, I don't know if you're pointing at me, Mohan, or if I should stop and let other people speak. It was sort of like, I don't know how to read that action.
No, I'm not pointing at you, Iccha. I was just signaling to Rich as he could point the cameras to Pooja and Debalina. But
yeah, but I mean, I think that's a good point of transition to let my co-panelist also speak, and so I don't take up all of the, you know, all of the time here. So maybe that's a good transition as well, to hear from them.
Your ideas, Debalina. I'm from India, and my research focuses on women from the global South, migrant women. So I would like to share from that standpoint. So for women in India, because of its patriarchal culture, it is difficult to gain equality in family, in society, and economy and leadership positions. So women in India confront issues of discrimination, inequalities, and social exclusion. So the discourses of empowerment and labor mobility push these women out of their livelihood into spaces where, like rich countries, and these women, when they move out of these countries, especially the international airports, they become spaces of asserting national identities and reproducing racism, and reinforcing different status of people, like low-skilled workers or high-skilled workers, and so on. So India is one of the largest exporters of skilled migrants, especially healthcare workers. So in India, the healthcare economy is tied to caste and gender, especially if you look at nursing. Nursing was taken up by women from Christian communities and low Hindu communities. So because the upper caste Hindus considered a dirty or polluting job because it involved touching the wounded bodies. And so mostly the skilled migrants are Christians or from low income communities. And the studies or the methods used to study migrants from the global south don't focus on the issues of caste or class. They are often generalizations that we see, and I think it is important to adopt an intersectional approach to understand the experiences of skilled migrants from the global south, to understand their everyday lived experiences.
Thank you. Great. So sort of I will draw out some of the key points that the three of you highlighted. Iccha, you talked about intersections, but also thinking through intersections in multiple ways, through multiple registers. And that brought up to the question of, being attentive to context and context defining the notion of inclusion, but also specifically shaping relationships. And engaging in the question of method from within the contexts, realizing that different narratives have different entry points. And your example of Nepal and India is a great example to really think through how we complicate the workings of power. You also talked about the emphasis on looking at embodied conversations by placing the body as the site for doing work, doing method work, right? Debalina, you talked about technology as method, and within that, you drew attention to the notion of technology as a medium that works through boundaries as well as actually breaks those boundaries, right? You talked about complexifying the notion of what the technology is and its role in the field as a medium, but also sort of complicating the notion of what does it mean to import methods from standardized machineries located in the global north. And then that connected to the notion of what does it mean when you actually bring back the narratives you have collected into the circuits of global north as you're presenting your work to the gatekeepers and getting it validated through the gatekeepers. And you finally talked about the question of affect. Pooja, in your conversation, you brought up caste. You brought up the notion of touch in your work with women migrant nurses from India who are largely Dalit or Christian. You brought up the ways in which caste complicates gender and notions of mobility into the global north. And how then do we look at through that lens of caste and gender when considering questions of method? Great. Let's move on to the.
Can I just add something, or just?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, something that Debalina said, I think, is worth repeating, which is that when we are so focused on adhering to the prescribed method, and thinking of how legitimizing it so that because that is tied to the politics of academia, right? So when we are confined in that space, even though we understand and know, right, this is prescriptive, where we have to follow a certain rule, do it a certain way in order to be legitimizing it, right? It really creates a challenge too, and I think something that we need to maybe think through or talk about, which is really personal struggles, as well as maybe academic struggles, professional struggles, when you are trying to think outside of that space, particularly if you're in a precarious situation or a position where you feel, you don't want to take on those, but you have to in order to survive, right? And I think that is a legitimate and a very important question that we cannot negate, that sometimes we have to do it for survival. But at the same time, it really does create this further legitimizing of the same methodology and keep erasing what we're trying to do. So it's a very difficult dichotomy, I think, and a position to be in, and something that we don't talk about enough and needs to be, I think, maybe, thought through. And I don't know that I have an answer to that, but I just feel like I'm constantly struggling with that personally as well, knowing in terms of trying to navigate all of those puzzles and, fit those together. And I really just want to reiterate that was just something that, Debalina touched on, but maybe something more in terms of answering your first question as well.
it goes back to the days of the colonizer, right? And sort of the ways in which the colonizer validates or invalidates what that method is going to be and what is going to count as method, you know. I think of a powerful story, and you know, I once had a PhD student who was interviewing women on their access to reproductive health. And you know, within there, so I will invite, without putting them on the spot, I would invite them to jump on when it comes to Q&A. But the point is that they had decided to turn off the recorder because that was important to that context. But really what that translated to is then this white male committee member asking, did they ever actually do the work, or were they making up the data all along? So that demonstrates the power of the violence, particularly embedded in this liberal machinery of whiteness, you know. So we can come back to that in the Q&A session. Let's move on to the next question, which is, what are the gendered contours of methods in the Global South? Debalina, perhaps we start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Iccha. And it also goes back to the work that you do. And I have so much of respect for the work that you live. I think that's very important to talk. So much of what we do in the field also resonates into what we do off field. And there are so many times, you know, and we've been colleagues, and I've found you raising your voice, putting some of those concerns in, you know, as a woman of color, and you know, salute to that. I'd like to begin with that and probably talk about or discuss this question of gendered contours as methods as dissonance in Global South. And what I mean by that is dissonance is at the heart of what we do. We cannot have consonance for the reason because methods are empirical. Let's put it at that way. Like when you look at methods, you know, they're books, they're prescriptions of what's okay and what's not. And by extension, if they're empirical, they are patriarchal, like science, right? The science of research, if you kind of go into that. So you have very less space for a lot of rich cues that happen in the field, that develop in the field. And by extension, these methods also have very less patience for how we react in the field with our participants, because it's never a solo reaction that we coming back. It's almost like harvesting something or buying something or getting something from somewhere. This GPS method of data gathering is always in dissonance with what we actually do in the field. So let me elaborate this further. So it's the question of what works and what doesn't in the field based upon the knowledge that we have gathered, the kind of training that we have had. And training itself is, again, a very empirical instrument, because training always is about this check boxes. Like these are the list of things we do and the list of things we don't, or the trouble we might get into if we do them. And the question that I always asked myself when I got into the field was, what am I trying to do here? And what am I trying to get out of this? So yes, I have my research design. I have my questions. I'm fully prepared. I, as a researcher, am the perfect instrument. I have a PhD for an YZ institution. I've been trained with the experts. I've worked with people who've mentored me. But then whom are the methods for? Are they for my stakeholders to whom I'm going to get back the knowledge? Are they for, the knowledge systems are already in place and I'm just going to add something more to that? Are the methods more for my sake, like what's suited to me, like the convenience sampling? Like, am I going to just interview people in and around my comfort zone? Or are my methods more suited to my participants, the people who truly matter in this case, right? And if I'm doing that, my question would be then, whom are my methods for? I'd probably start with that question. And it is the heart of this dissonance, because I'm not writing for them. I can never write for them. And I can never take back my research in 100, what I gathered from the field. I can never take it back to them in the purest of the form that you think, right? Now, if we go by Newton's third law, and don't even ask me why I'm putting that in. If the reaction, the action has a reaction, how much of that reaction am I putting back? But the effort that these people have put in. And in global south, the concept of transaction is so different from the global north. So it's not the money or the effort that I'm putting in, right? It's my relationship. And in terms of relationship, there's so much more from my end. Like, can I sleep in peace at night? And I'm sure no book covers that. I'm sure if there is something, we have to talk about it. So the method itself, I feel, is a living entity. I personally feel that method is never the words that are written in a book. It's a living thing. We're living it. And like you said, Iccha, like you said, Pooja, we are living it. Our bodies live it. Our participants live it. And we co-create the stories together. A nod of our head, a touch of our body makes so much of difference. If I probably would get into so much of trouble if actually I already knew how much I'm touching my participants. Like as we are talking, that gesture, where is it? The hug. Oh my God, that's scandalous. Can't even dare put it in there. So, I mean, it totally changes the ways in which we do and write things. And when we are leaving that emotion out to just putting the data in there, what data are we talking about? So it brings me back to this heart of conversation, the dissonance that I always find. It has always been a struggle for me. When we talk about the reflexivity of a researcher, this is probably one of the most, I think, photoshopped ideas that are ever there. We never put in what's in our mind. Oh my God, is that on record? We didn't hear that. No, we do, but in a very sterilized kind of a way, right? You just don't put in half of the thoughts that go. And I'll give you a simple example. You'll probably identify with that. If you have ever in global south, let's take for example India or any crowded place, even if that done in Singapore as well. When I've started to record a person, there's always a crowd. There's always a crowd of people. If the concept of privacy, it doesn't exist, and there always be people like, why aren't you sharing this? Tell her that. She'll like that. Oh, you forgot that. So it becomes a community-based data gathering. It's a celebration of those stories. And I'm sure if you read my work, nowhere have I mentioned celebration, because that's a dissonance. If you know what I mean, I'll hand it over. I'm getting more emotional. Thank you.
Pooja?
So one thing that I've noted is that, the power lies with the experts, so they kind of decide what works for the communities. So I think it's time to rethink, what worked for the community. It should be given on the hands of the communities to decide, what will work for them. And the migrants from the global south, they are treated as passive recipients of messages. I think that should change. And in our methods, like, we kind of think, is it going according to our ethics, what we have put in our ethics application and things like that. So I think, that should change. And the power should be given in the hands of communities to decide what works for them based on their lived experiences.
Powerful ideas, and again, there's a lot of synergy between what you're saying, particularly in terms of transferring power, right? And then who owns the power of deciding the methods and the guidelines and contours of methods. Iccha.
Yeah, thank you both, and thank you, Debalina, especially for saying what you do. This is why I love listening to you always, because, this is a great example of what you were saying, and I'll illustrate this by really my response to this question when we were talking about what are the gender contours of method, thinking in the way that we're trained of method, right? Thinking of gender immediately, I was putting notes in terms of really from that, and as you were talking, I was like, wait, gender contour, me, right, as a female, right, and those spaces, like, wow, wait a minute, right? So that just changes the whole conversation, because that is also should be part of the conversation, but we've learned to erase that aspect of that, right? And so immediately, like, even though I know, it's just so ingrained in the way we do things that I was like, I was looking at my notes and then, okay, yeah, right, this is the way. And I had like, just kind of thinking from a research perspective and not thinking and I say this all the time when I'm teaching, right? But to practice it is so different to say, I am the instrument, I am part of that research, and I also share, but also, have a privileged position from my participants almost always. right? And that realization, and I always talk about it, but it never enters those spaces of, writing, never enters those spaces of, publication. So it just becomes disconnected in some ways. And I think that's part of, really illustrating the point that you're making of the dissonance and the disconnect that we have when we're thinking of that. And I just was like, wait a minute, right? Come back to that point of intersection where we are who we are, and that is part of the research that we do. And in fact, right, we, need to start bringing that out more. And I just, really appreciate that. And I was looking at, I was like, I don't even want to talk about these answers, right? This responses that I had that were such an academic way of thinking about it and not thinking about it in a very individualized understanding of really, what I said earlier about embodiment of lived experiences, that we're almost always thinking about our community, our partners, and then forgetting about those joys and celebrations and the sorrow and the hardships and the struggle, the emotions that you go through in that process. And that becomes part of you for stories to be told in your family, right? With your friends, like, I'm getting emotional thinking about like what has been left out, right? Yeah. But seriously, I mean, you just got me there. But I thinking about that, and I think the points that I think from that to be made is that just kind of thinking about going back to this first question, the intersections then, right? So maybe there's a fourth level of intersection that, I wasn't thinking about, that I would add to my answer to the earlier point, which is that intersections of us as individuals, as women, as, women from or scholars and researchers from the Global South located in certain spaces, right? Those intersections of who we are and how we produce our work, how we do our work, and how that needs to be connected to method, right? And so I think that just, and I would say that, yeah, we need that fourth conversation to happen and to really rethink that process of, method. And when we talk about centralizing voices and lived experiences, not to forget our own journey and struggles and relationships and community, right? And what it takes to actually get to where we are. Yeah.
Thank you so much, all three of you, for that authenticity. There is just so much here. I will highlight some key points before moving into the third prompt. So you talk about dissonance and disconnect, Debalina, and making visible these dissonances. Pooja, you talk about power, who owns the power, and thinking about how we center communities as owners of this power. And Iccha, you talk about centering the journey of a woman of Global South academic in that process, as engaging in that method, centering the body, the intersections of the body as a woman, particularly women as researchers, contextualizing voices, their own journeys, struggles, and relationships. Let's move on to the third question, which is about the labor of gendered work. And we will start that question with you, Pooja. And let me read that prompt out for our audience. The prompt is, what are the methodological learnings that emerge from the labor to study the gendered nature of essential work of care in the Global South?
Thank you for the question, Professor Mohan. So from my learnings, I would like to share that listening has the power to open up platforms for interrogating inequalities and the global distribution of power, and community participation in the decision-making process has a transformative potential. So I'd like to share an example from my place. So there, it is called Universty. So it is a community organization of neighborhood groups. So currently it has 43 lakh women. So these are women from the margins. So they have come together and worked together in neighborhood groups, opening up community kitchens and fed their communities and earned living as well. So that is a transformative potential of coming together, where community comes together and holds the decision-making power. So that is one of the learnings from my field, which I'm, inspired. And I think the power should be in the hands of community to own the power.
Beautiful. Thanks, Pooja. Iccha?
I mean, I think in some ways we've sort of touched on this in our other responses, right? And I think, and even the comments that are there, which is, kind of thinking about really bringing out the labor. We don't talk about the labor, particularly for the kind of work that many of us do here, working with minority groups, marginalized groups, vulnerable communities, right, excluded communities, stigmatized communities, and that labor in terms of, not just the field work, right? Because when we think about it from a methodological perspective, when we think about labor and field work, there's a very labor in a market logic kind of understanding of labor. But I think what we don't always talk about is the emotional labor and the tensions that we go through and the choices that you have to make when you're thinking about the writing versus, continuing your relationship with the community, what you can give back to the community, because you are also using those extractive methodology for your own purposes, right? And so those kind of tensions and discussions, we don't always think about that. And of course, and I think when you ask from emerge from the labor to study the gendered nature of essential work of care, I mean, that alone in itself too, I was struggling with, because to talk about emotion, to talk about those kind of care, do we have to think about that as a gendered notion of understanding, right? That alone kind of furthers this idea that somehow, there is this objective post-positive understanding of method, and that is not right. Of course, we say it's not related to care, ethics of care, but when we talk about gendered nature of method, it starts to create that dichotomy of, when we go beyond that, talking about labor in different forms and ways, then it somehow has to be gendered. Unless we are talking about gender inequalities, gender complexities, right, gender identities, then that, of course, we're talking about ways of knowing and being and your lived experience. And I think that's a very different conversation. So I guess, my apologies, all these questions, I seem to, right, and maybe this is speaking to your ability to be a teacher, constantly questioning the questions in terms of how it's the frame. I love the way you frame it, but at the same time, it's giving me a lot of pause, because, I think 10 years ago, I would have responded very differently than now, where I'm thinking, well, what do you mean? Like, why does it have to be right this way or that way? And then I think maybe that's sort of where I am in terms of my own journey to look at it in that way. And of course, that is also the other point, is that we are often reflective, right? And which we don't talk about, is that our journey and where we are in life and our positions, and maybe all the gray hair, gives you a different way of responding to certain things and thinking about it in a different way. So yeah, so I just, I think in all, I think our conversation just speaks to the fact of the labor that is not discussed, was particularly when we are thinking about right in the context of care, or even in the context of method, and really locating in or from right global South and doing that kind of research.
Thank you, Iccha. Beautiful points, particularly in terms of thinking through what kinds of labor count, right? In method, also what kinds of labor are rendered visible and legible. And I think that's a really powerful point for us to think through. But also, that you're asking the framing of the question, I think we need to ponder about that framing, that does the labor of care have to be gendered, recognizing the materiality of care being gendered in our everyday lives, right? So, Debalina.
Okay. Thank you. This has been so emotional for me. I feel I'm in a safe space. I can share what's on my mind. Sometimes it make no sense to me. But thank you for being so kind and trying to make sense of that. For me, I see this labor that we kind of put in or trying to put in, I see that as therapy. And I see there's ways for us to heal. And we heal by talking. We heal by reaching out. We heal by bonds and relationships. And of course, taking privilege into context. How many times have we been touched by that smile, that look on someone's face as they're talking to us? Or maybe when they stop a minute and ask us, like, have you had your food? Or is this okay to share? When their stories become our stories. How many times have we pondered and thought about, how this makes sense to us and how this is healing to what we might be doing out there and how it inspires us to be more privileged, if you know what I mean, right? And then when you leave the field doesn't leave you. So methodologically, you are never out of there. Global South is you. You're at the heart of it. And then probably this goes back into the research of being the instrument, and I would say that we're living it. Even we are a living document of the methods. We live those. We embody those, right? In our bodies, our minds, our spirit, our emotions, we live those. And it sees us being, that of boundaries. I think it becomes that of emotions and feelings, something that we probably should bring back into our writings as well. And we should have outlets that allow us to do that. Allow is a very interesting word again, this kind of very interesting. And then how do we even speak a certain way, be a certain way, have a desired identity when those methods are put in front of us? So it's always in dissonance, as I've talked before. And I feel that when you talk about the methodological learnings, I think each of us, if we do this kind of work, we're rookies, and we take our emotions in a very interesting way. There never has been, I'm not very sure, and please correct me if we are passionate about this, then we can't keep our emotions out of it. But then having our emotions in the field is not a bad thing. If anything, it helps us build solidarity. And doesn't that serve a purpose? Sorry. Thank you.
Just how powerful, thank you for all your testimonies. This is so powerful. Debu, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to say anything? Go for it.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm going to address this thing about embodiment. So what Mohan was referring to earlier, the person who got questioned by her advisor about whether her data was real, yeah, that was me. I was all of 29 years old. It was singularly the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to me. Because I was in the West, my advisor was wise and powerful. And for it to even be suggested and verbalized that in fact I had spent a year on the field and not done anything when I had in fact been moving from primary healthcare center to primary healthcare center, interviewing women. Okay, so and it put me off being in Western research in a very powerful, emotional and embodied way, because I knew I had no answer. And I knew that people would keep asking me those questions. And if I stayed in that system, I would be subject to those questions all the time. And I couldn't keep explaining it. And I couldn't keep explaining myself. It was absolutely terrifying. I can't tell you how scared I was. And if Mohan had not been there to rescue me, actually, which is what he did, he rescued me. And he became my advisor and he understood what I was saying because he understood the context. And maybe at that age, I wasn't developed enough a researcher to be able to explain things. And it took me 20 years coming back to India. I've done research fieldwork in 14 states in India, in different languages with interpreters. Now I feel that I have the confidence to say that, what, I learned certain methodologies, but those have failed me. I have used them as sort of, leverage or starting point. But the net, I mean, the things I learned in my training, many of them have failed me because they don't work. And so that, you know, the example Mohan mentioned about turning my recording off, of course you do that to respect people. As Debalina said, whose side am I on here? You know, so it began with this fear that the question of whose side I was on would be questioned. And it was questioned both among the people I was talking to and in the question of Western academia. And it's really taken me all these years to get over that fear. So I'm very happy to see you guys. And I hope I will see you guys again.
Can I respond to that? Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And if there's any consolation, it's always a challenge, right? When you are the first person and you're faced with that. But I have to say that I think your lessons and what you had there has impacted us in our research in that way, because there's a precedent in terms of saying, right, this is the way it works in the global south and this is the way we got to do it, because there is a way to do it. So it's always hard when you're the first one and kind of breaking those grounds. And I have to say, like, for my own dissertation, that was really key in being able to do that. But I think that I lost my train of thought, and I had a second point related to that. But I think, so the second point is that I think from that sense, I take solace to the fact that, even today, now that we're having this conversation, that conversation has grown, that it's not only in a closed space that one person has to face that challenge, right? That we can collectively come together and stand there for each other and say, and have those conversations. So I think in that sense, the field has grown and in really, right, Mohan has been instrumental in that. But I think there's, over the years, many of us coming through that, see that. And so I think I just wanted to, go back to right, the ethics of care and acknowledgement, and just I think it's important to appreciate that.
And I just want to add here to say, Debo, you were my first advisee, and your experiences taught me so much in my journey. And part of this recognition is also recognizing that the women of color, the women from the global south, who are actually not here in this process of the hierarchy of Western white academia, patriarchal academia, simply because, Debalina, going back to the question of whose side I am on, they decided that I'm not going to play this bloody game, So we need to acknowledge the bodies that have been erased, that have been pushed out, that have been, and I see a number of you here that are here that have paid that price because you said, I'm not going to give away my integrity. I see you, and we see you. I want to come to a question that Xiaofei has shared, and any of you feel free to jump in. This question is, I doubt, and this goes back to Iccha, your point, I doubt why the action and emotion of care become feminine and why actions and bodies have to be gendered. I think part of the answer is the non-females need to stand on a higher place in hierarchy, and the fact that they disguise oppression and extraction under the blanket gender. So anyone feel free to.
I could take a stab at it. First off, thank you so much for your question. I do my best to kind of make sense of how I see this. I think when we talk about gender, one thing also that we need to bring into conversation is it's not a masculine, feminine, it goes beyond that. Now, if you take the LGBT community into consideration and all the others, and even the kind of, we cannot delegitimize the environment within which the questions of methods are embedded. And that is what we go into the field and we see. What's a cultural context? What's a history? Right? How things are set up. And no matter where we go, we are again limited by our vocabularies. So what's sanctioned to use in that particular space and what's not sanctioned, what I can get away with and what I cannot get away with. So not only are we restricted by the data that, that can be published or that can be standardized to suit the interest of people, where we approach certain things in and around us, how we see things, they're also subjected to those limited vocabulary, if you will, right? And this also brings in the context of power. When you talk about why the action and emotion of care becomes feminine, because traditionally that is how it has been described. And we do not have alternative voices to kind of look into that and say, no, we will have alternate vocabularies to kind of understand this. And this is how we best reach out to most of the stakeholders. Unfortunately or fortunately, this is where we stand. Can we move and dismantle? Absolutely, there's work to that end. But I think the question that we have is, the disguise of oppression and extraction under the blanket gender, we have to agree here. It's a fact. But does it mean that we are not questioning the fact that we are questioning this also means that, there will be alternate ways of knowing, repositories, stuff that we still don't have any idea about, but we are building knowledge towards that. And part of that is also because we have been reading too much on the standardized repositories that limits our vocabularies, our understanding of what's okay, what's not. And then the whole feminine, masculine, I think it totally erases the legitimacy of the LGBT community. And we haven't touched in our conversation. Doesn't mean they don't exist or their needs and wants are any less. But we don't have those necessary vocabularies when we are looking at a political environment within which we are situated. What gets sanctioned? If you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I would add, something that you said, Debalina, just made me think of, whenever, I talk about my work as the intersection of gender and culture and health, but I also, acknowledge the fact that when I talk about gender, we're talking about it in a very heteronormative, cisgender, whiteness, understanding of gender, right? But the limitation and your point about limitation of vocabulary is that if I say women's health, it's connected to women's health as in biological conditions, right? We're not thinking about women in a holistic way. So there is no way to differentiate that I'm actually talking about women's health in a social context, as opposed to, right, thinking about women and not, and their ailments and all of the health conditions in relation to that social context, because there is a very distinctive understanding. And I'm not sophisticated enough to re-theorize, right, the women's health versus gender. So, I am limited in terms of how I then use the tool, but I always, try to also have that discussion and acknowledge the fact that I am also integrating myself and using that, conversation in a limited space and maybe I don't know, what is the word, just sort of the power position, right, of doing that, because I am limited in that, but very well knowing that in doing that, I am also creating a box around that definition, that identity, and leaving out conversations. But at the same time, I don't know how else to do it. And so, I always struggle with that personally too, whenever I use it, because I'm always, kicking myself for doing it, but then I have no other way of also saying what I want to say, because that does capture in many ways the gender inequalities that I'm talking about, but I'm also talking about a specific context and populations, right? And so I think, just to illustrate the point that you're making, I think if I understand it correctly, in terms of how sometimes we have to use the tools and the language of the master, right, in order to sort of be, again, going back to your point about legitimacy and legitimizing and those struggles, but at the same time trying to open up that spaces for discussion. And I think maybe that's where we become the interlocutor and then say, well, let's open up that definition, and it's not only this way or that way, right? I think of it in this way and envision it this way. This actually maybe opens up that spaces of conversation. So it's maybe where we start to then not take it holistically and wholeheartedly and say, this is the way, right? But to say, this is problematic, but I'm still using it, and this is how we should change it, or these are the conversation that needs to happen with it, so that we start to open up those boundaries of conversations, I think.
Powerful. You both demonstrate how ontological categories work to erase, even as they give conceptual tools to engage with the inequalities, right? So the LGBTQI example is a really powerful one to grapple with within that context. Pooja, you had a question. Do you want to actually turn on your video and share that question with us? It's a beautiful question.
It is.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I cannot turn on my video, but I'm actually, I initially thought I'll just talk instead of typing because questions are messy. And I was, so, my background, sociology in India, very, and then sociology again at Purdue. And then I was completely disillusioned with the methodological sort of explanation, how they were taught. So I turned to critical intercultural comms for my PhD. So now, so my main work has always been with understanding caste and race, relationship between those, and also how class, dialect between class and class. And I've recently ventured into, going and studying them. And the Dalit, I have been, studying Dalit and Dalit movements lately. And so what struggles that I've always found, and specifically working in a very Western setting, you feel very isolated if you're working on caste, because you don't find people to talk to. You don't know how to, describe caste that operates as extremely discriminative racist system. I think caste racism prevalent in India. So the question that I sort of have here is, I'll give an example of issues about environment. So apparently it might seem to be a non-caste issue, right? But as you delve into it, actually, you have to look at it. It depends on who is dealing with that environment, who's been impacted. And when you talk about that, that's when you see all these different groups, Adivasis, Dalit movement, but within the Dalit movements, there are fractions of the Dalit women's movement, and there is middle class. So my question is, if given these complexities and the dialectics of caste, class, and gender, then how do we really study movements? I say movements and not just social movements, because I think it's futile to distinguish between social movements and political movements. I guess all social movements are sort of political if you're striving towards some kind of justice. So how do we do that through the lens of intersectionality? And also, how do we locate the markers to develop the methodology? I remember from critical intercultural comms, we were taught about, thinking about the context, thinking about the power, thinking about the history, thinking about who is writing those, stories or histories or the narratives. But I find it that everything is so sort of intertwined. How do you tease out, and how do you write your paper in a way that gets accepted by publishers in the Western, context? Because in our kind of work, I don't think there's a distinction between theory and method. They speak to each other. They are kind of enmeshed. So, what are your take on that? How do we look at these markers, and how do we make it? I'm not looking for acceptance, but I'm talking about how do we really understand what's going on? Because everything gets blurred. All those categories get blurred as you delve more into it. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm humbly trying to go for it. if I have your permission, Purba. Thank you, Iccha and Pooja, for the opportunity to let me go. There are two strands to this, Purva. And I first off, hats off for doing this kind of research that talks about the difficulties of even understanding who a Dalit is or what Dalit is, who or what a Dalit is, because even that is so not clearly demarked. How do we discuss untouchability? How do we talk about the complexities and this reducing a human soul to almost nothing, to structures who are not used to this? So it's almost like showing unicorn to spectators when they do not have any idea of how a unicorn looks like, if you know what I mean. And then probably going back to how we do this. Now, again, research, I personally feel, and humbly I feel, is essentially a personal thing till the point it's not published. Till the point we haven't presented data to the stakeholders in a way that makes sense, it's all ours. And that's a very powerful thing to consider. That if that's ours, it belongs to our, co-created by our participants and us, depending upon where and what we want to achieve with that data or methods is where we probably begin with. So we could write papers and we will do our best to work with the language that we have. We could write books where it becomes a bit more autonomous. We tried, of course, it's always persuading this idea to another stakeholder. Probably that's where the complexity lies. And with the data, we can head our own movement. We can start a movement. We can write, we can petition, we can open our own NGOs. So the data, to the point that it's data, and again, data is a very Western construct, and I apologize for that. To the point that we hold that information, we're kind of very powerful in terms of what we want to do with it and how to proceed with it. In my work, what I found, and I say this very humbly, is what I found was making people understand when I'm trying to say something new. And I would always have to work with the markers that I had. And this was a decision that also led to my own growth as a researcher. And what I wanted to do in the academy. Did I want to be in the academia? Did I want to open my own consultancy? Or do I want to actually give back to the grassroots by staying there, if that is pragmatically possible? And we are not saying that all of this is not possible. We can't tick every tick box. But of course, one takes precedence. And that we should be able to, unfortunately or fortunately, then we make those choices of what gets included and what doesn't. So to what extent would our language support what being a Dalit means, a Dalit woman means, to people who they're not familiar with that term, to make them understand. And once you have that, and that becomes a pathway for others to work in that direction. And on the top of my mind, I'm thinking of people who would be interested to work with you, or someone who would be working with you on this, or your work that would elicit that kind of discussion. You have made that pathway. But when you want to make that pathway, probably, again, from a very pragmatic standpoint, we work with the language we have. And we keep working until we have introduced some new vocabulary into that, is what I'm trying to get at.
Kia
ora.
Yeah. I'm gonna piggyback off on Debalina there, and I think first say this loudly, that it is okay to resist, and it's okay to not wholeheartedly take what is being taught and to turn its head on, right? And so some of the questions, and I really appreciate your questions that you were asking, but this is something that I've struggled with and come to say to myself, it is because we're trained in this way. We are in the Western space, right? We are playing to the academic rule that sometimes we forget to say, no, that doesn't apply. It goes back to Debalina, Debalina's experience of being asked of why, why did you turn off the recorder? Well, that is because what I needed to do, and to because, you know, for my participants, for that space, the way that research is done, and out of respect, right? And to say that, and I think, you know, it's hard, right, to say that, to say, no, I'm not gonna, you know, follow your rules because just because you say this is the way it is, that it has to be this way. And so I think, you know, to have a space like this, to find each other, and to sort of support that, and in solidarity, and, you know, when we do reviews and when we talk to our students, we start building those ideas in, I think it is very important. The second thing I would say is that, yes, you're right. When we do this kind of research, theory and method is often merged. And this is something that, that we've been, I think, talking about today as well, in terms of separating that out, because this is almost like, you know, we take the Western ideas of theories and then we then pick a method and then we marry them together and we go and do the study. But what we're here saying is, look, you know, we're going to theorize along with the method. The method is the theory, theory is the method. It's going to be married together in the process, right? And I think, and that is also, of course, challenging when you're trying to come out of that space and write a paper and get it published. But I think, you know, that is, even though that is a challenge, there's more and more of us talking about it, trying to do that kind of research to say, you know, this is, you know, and part of what we do. But unfortunately, our comm people love, you know, where's the theory, right? How do you theorize? And you go, isn't this whole paper theorizing something? You know, just, yeah, and thinking, and of course that question comes up because you've taken the global South as an entry point of theorizing, and then all of a sudden, where's this theory? Well, I don't want to take your theory and take it somewhere else. I want to give you what I think should be coming out of there, right? And of course, it's a struggle because, you know, and I say, of course, it's struggle, like almost like we should accept it, and I'm not meaning it in that way, but I'm just saying, yes, that's part of the struggle that we have, and maybe some of the questions that we had earlier about our learnings, about the labor, and all of those things. And so to answer that question in more example way, right? And intersectionality, for example, because I use intersectionality in health comm. And the way I've done it is, you know, I took intersectionality. Yes, it's a Western idea, it's a Western concept, but it works when you're talking about gender inequalities. But it doesn't work in the same way when you're talking about, you know, South Asia. We're not talking about, you cannot swap out race and put in caste, right? You cannot swap out, you know, different ideas of Western notions of intersections and just, you know, take one and take that out. So what, you know, so my argument was that, look, in this context, based on the studies that I've done in different countries, the intersections are really, right, gender relations, right, which connects to the notions of family expectations, right, patriarchy, oppression, violence, all of those cultural practices of those things, how that connects to healthcare, because I'm interested in health communication, and then the risk and vulnerabilities that are created. And now those are a broad notion of intersections, but you can think about that in the context of India, you can think about it in the context of China, you can think about it in the context of Nepal, right? Because those are things, it's a very different, you know, so this goes back to my point that I made at the beginning about South to South kind of discussion of point of theorization. So I think what we need to not be fearful of is taking some of those Western notions and rethinking it in the global South sense of, you know, thinking about how does that apply? Like I get what you're saying, but it's, you know, you can't just take it and do a comparative study or look at it in that way. But how do we actually maybe find vocabulary, language, as Debalina was saying, to give back, right, for as a way to expand that conversation so somebody else can look at it or use it as an entry point to kind of keep having those conversations, right? And so I think, you know, your struggle is real in really locating and doing work. Even when you were talking about, I think, Pooja, about Western feminist, right? Feminist solid movements. But then whenever we think about feminism, you know, it really has a very Western notion. But I think you could take that idea and give back in the sense of, what does it mean? Like, what do you mean by feminist solid movements? There's points of theorization right there that changes those conversations, changes that lens, maybe opens up that space. So I think, you know, instead of saying how to do that, like my response would be, how can I change it so that it includes this particular space and the way that we can talk about it in the Global South context?
Thank you, all three of you. I want to turn to our audience to see if anyone else has any questions they would like to ask. Priyanka, go for it.
Debalina mentioned that data is a Western concept. And I was just wondering that how is that? How and why is that?
Debalina, you want to respond?
Sure, thank you so much. So the reason I said that is because, working data is closely intertwined with science. So the idea of science is extractive, research, science, research, they're co-constructed in meaning. And the idea of data is then something that's an output at the end of a process. Now that process, how we define is it's rooted in rationality, right? It has to be rational, it has to proceed in a certain way, have these checks and balances in place. So by the virtue of that being so standardized, rationalized, and as you know, how the feminist scholars in science would argue that this whole harvesting or getting something out of a process, the information that we get, and it's again used for extractive reasons, if I may say so, that makes it essentially something to think about. That it's definitely not what it's been made to believe it is, that it definitely serves some purpose that is not really, I think, benefit of mankind, if they put it. And that's probably the ontology or the truth behind what's and how it's collected, or some is probably the reason why I kind of put that in there.
Thank you. Debo, go for it. Do you want to unmute yourself?
I find this notion of a community of thinkers who are thinking their way out of a situation that was made historically valid, and the weight of that situation, which is basically the weight of these understandings, right? What data means, what methodology means, what is permitted within the borders of these things. Basically, what I see all of you here trying to do is think your way out of that. And I think that community is possibly the most powerful weapon we have for that. Because, as somebody who has basically, in terms of the research I've done, I've been working alone for many years now. And there are a lot of things that you know would work better if you could build it with somebody. And from that point of view and that point of understanding, I think what is happening here is really powerful, actually. That's what I have to say.
What you're saying is powerful, and having you here is powerful, as you said, it's a 20-year journey in the making, but it's here, so that is itself powerful. I do want to come back to this one concept, and I'm going to push you all a little bit, which is the concept of solidarity. Solidarity sounds all good on paper, but it's your brown people that make careers out of POCO and critical theory and all that would be the first ones to put you under the bus when it actually comes to being beside you when the structures come after you. So I would like us to unpack really what that politics of solidarity looks like when we live it. So any of you, you're welcome.
I'll take a small step. For me, solidarity never came from my work. I think the strongest source of support in spirit or otherwise I got from Mohan and you guys, right, who have been intimately associated with CARE. And I learned so much from you, from our formal conversations, informal conversations, So personally, what I knew was the solidarity never, usually you would get 1 or 2 people who are willing to listen to you, and then that's where you get in with the quality of your work. I feel that the solidarity comes in when you know what you're doing, when you know yourself well, when you know your methods and what you want. Sometimes it's hard, and I'm not professing to know all the answers. I have no idea at this point, right? Like post PhD, I'm not even sure what this means. But I've personally felt that solidarity is an everyday thing. You get solidarity even from objects that have no connection with you. Solidarity could be from a leaf that falls from a tree, and then it can totally, that can be your universe at that time. You just enjoy that. Okay, here where I think I'm losing it at this point. But you know what I mean, right? I mean, you totally know what I mean. So even to define solidarity is a disservice, I would say, Mohan. And this is giving back to you for asking us questions. Like, you know, so what does even solidarity mean? It means that we exist in the tower of cliques and groupism, and we don't want to be that. We want to do best what we do. Sometimes just thinking about it and not doing anything is the best that we will do for the day. And that's solidarity for us. And whoever supports that is solidarity. Because relationship makes it. And when we talk about solidarity, it's so institutionalized. So somebody can be my friend, then 2 years later, they're not my friend. And I ask you this, have you lost friends in Facebook? If yes, like, where did that solidarity go? I mean, it's just me and my research.
No, it's not just you, Debalina. There's agreement in the chat too. And then I also think, like, solidarity to me is is performative, really, right? People use it as a way to sort of perform, action to me speak louder than saying, well, in solidarity, and people use that word like, just throw it around. And so I have a love-hate relationship with this word solidarity, because, oh yeah, sometimes you do want to say in solidarity because what you really meant is in spirit, right? I'm there with you, I understand you, but I don't really understand you because I'm not in that place, that position, but I feel you, right? But then sometimes you say in solidarity because, it really is a tool of performance. So it's not just, I think, yes, if somebody throws you under the bus, at least you can go, roll up your sleeve and you can go to war, right? And be like, what are you doing? But then when it's performative, that's when it becomes toxic, and that's when it becomes hard, because you can't do anything, right? Because it's all nice, and then as becomes a group of doing that. So I mean, it really is a hard question in that way, in terms of, right, what does that mean? But I think really, I mean, to me, solidarity is really, you don't have to say it if you can show it in action. You don't have to say it in solidarity if you can speak up, if you can be there, if you are really advocating, you are politics of citations, right? Of using our work and promoting each other. I mean, you don't have to say inside, because it's understood, because as Debalina said, it's relationships, right? It doesn't have to be. So yeah, so when people say that or when I hear it, I know that's my reaction.
And it goes back to what Debo was saying about community, right? Really building community and creating that space. Pooja, did you want to add anything?
Yeah. So for me, like, solidarity is working alongside communities. So for me, my community participants have become more than friends to me. We kind of keep in contact with each other, especially during COVID times, just to see whether, we are okay, those kind of stuff. So when they share the experience, I can feel that, it is my struggle. I have to fight for them. There is nobody to listen. So they have become my people now. So
that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Yeah, and I think if you can say my people, you don't need to keep saying in solidarity.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Great. So let's sort of move toward wrapping up. Is there anything, Iccha, Debalina, Pooja, that you all want to add as we wrap this session up?
I just want to say thank you for the space, and then I think I echo what Debalina said about the community and just being there, and of course, just being there. That I hope the space that we've started and created and just kind of brought together, it turns into something bigger, right? That is just not like we're staying up and then we have a conversation and we are fueled by this and then we go off in our own world and that's it, they're done. So I really and I think the next step is thinking about ways in which we can make this more tangible, ways in which we can really make this real, right, in terms of helping each other or supporting each other, or no matter where you're located and what place in life you are in terms of your academic journey, right? That kind of yeah. So I just was thinking about what's next, right? And where do we go from here, and how do we get to a point where it can be really tangible community support and other ways in which this could really come together. But thank you for giving us an opportunity to just talk and share and be here today. And thank everyone for your questions and listening and just the responses. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you all so much. What a beautiful session. We will take